You know, you can tell Neil Gaiman wrote this book, or this episode. Like, if you've ever studied his works, or read his works, or watched his works, he has a particular style to him, and this fits it to a T. The moment I rewatched this, I was like, yeah, okay. Even before I looked up and found out that he was the one who did it. One of the core points of the episode is it does something Babylon 5 usually doesn't, in that it gives us a definitive answer, although it doesn't explain the how or the why. There is no real denying that these are the dead. You know, this isn't one of the situations where you can interpret it how you want, or you can come up with your own... No, they're dead. It makes it very clear that the prophetic stuff, the Kosh stuff, you know, this is clearly actually them. The fact that they know of their own death and how they died, that kind of a thing, right? So there's no real denying that. What I'm left wondering is why... How do I put this? Why do it in this manner? And again, I think that's leaning more towards just Neil Gaiman's overall writing style. You present a mystery, but it's not a true mystery. It's not like a... I shouldn't say true, that sounds elitist. What I mean by that is you present a fact, but you don't explain the fact, and then you walk away. So the lack of explanation of the fact is the mystery. It's kind of like a second layer mystery. And that is this in spades. You can make whatever you want of that. I'm not really going to talk about that. I'm just going to move forward on the assumption, obviously, that these are in fact the dead. Moving on. Penn and Teller's presence was okay. I'm not actually a huge fan of Penn and Teller myself. They're okay. You know, I mean, I'm not exactly, I don't hate them or anything like that, but I've never been a huge fan. One of the things they did in this episode was they tried to present things with the idea that comedy doesn't go across generations. And, you know, I was actually thinking about this myself and the discussion that you could have about this, the idea that comedy either does or does not cross generational boundaries. Personally, I think we could have a whole discussion about just this one topic, but I'm not going to get into that here since it's really a very minor point of the episode. All I'm going to bring up is the idea that I think it could be argued either way. That you could say that stuff from 50 years ago is funny or isn't funny, and that's kind of dependent on you, which is a little more keeping with Babylon 5's usual thing. It is worthy of note that a lot of this humor was done pretty much deliberately to not be funny, and at least on that they succeed. But I do love the little tidbit. There's this little just slid under moment where, you know, I'm not sure which is which of Penn and Teller. I think it's Penn is the big guy. You can tell I'm a huge fan, right? Where Penn's character, I guess Rebo, is saying... Zoot gives a joke, a Mimbari joke to Delenn, and she cracks up at it, very fake laughter, but she cracks up at it, and Penn just explains kind of as an aside, yeah, Mimbari humor is based on such and such rather than such and such, and of course we've studied Mimbari humor and Narn humor and Centaur humor. I liked that. I like the idea, because we kind of have that now, but to a somewhat lesser extent. There are certain humorous concepts that are more or less universal across the globe for humanity. But there are still comedians out there who will study American humor, British humor, Russian humor, Japanese humor, you know, and Greek humor, trying to hit a specific cultural demographic. And I love that idea of having to do that for different alien cultures as well, especially when you reach the Star Trek point, the interstellar point, where a race has more or less become more homogenized thanks to the fact that they have unified and reached out into the stars. The idea that you're effectively treating an entire race as a nation at that point, at least to analogize from science fiction to modern day. So I like that. I also have to make a quick note. A lot of people have argued that referential humor has the same problem, that if you're going to do referential humor, it's only going to work if you get the reference, obviously, but then, you know, you fast forward 10 years and nobody's going to get it. I don't think that's 100% true, not only because you can still get the joke, you can still get the humor without getting the joke. I bet some of you out there know what I mean by that, where you hear something and your mind can process why it's funny without knowing the specifics. You don't get the exact reference, but you get where the reference is going, and you still find the reference funny, right? And of course, there's the fact that, references can carry forward throughout history, blah, blah, blah. Moving on. Again, I don't want to get super into that topic. I like the legal distinction of we need to purchase this land and have it be ours, but don't worry, we'll give it back. We'll give it back. In almost every way, that is literally renting. But it is a key legal distinction because it has to be theirs. It has to be their ownership, their property for their particular religious ceremony. Or maybe it has to be that way in order to connect with the fifth dimension. I guess this will actually be the sixth dimension, in order to reach out to the spiritual realm. I don't know. I actually have no idea how that literally works. What I do know is that it is funny to me because this is not the first time we have seen in Babylon 5 a specific religious ceremony has functioned off of legalese, basically, and just kind of like, well, under these circumstances and under this purpose, we could do this at this time, and yada, yada, yada. Jakar's opposition to this whole thing bothers me. It's probably, I'd say, the one aspect of this episode I find to be lackluster. This is actually a pretty decent episode, to my surprise, really. Because, let me segue for a second here. Anyone remember Season 1? There were several episodes, I don't remember their names. There was one about a guy who hunts, I think it was just Soul Hunter was the name of the episode. And there was one about a monster thing with alien parasites that take over your body to purify people. And there were a couple of other basic, let's call them typical sci-fi stories in Season 1 of Babylon 5. And let's be honest, most shows, regardless of whatever their particular niche is, tend to have typical sci-fi episodes. And I bet most of you don't even need me to explain that phrase. I'm still going to just really quick, but I bet most of you are just nodding your heads like, yep, I know exactly what you mean. Season 1 of TNG also had a lot, Season 2 did as well, a lot of typical sci-fi episodes. Original series, typical. Farscape has typical sci-fi episodes. For those of you who don't know what I mean or aren't a big follower of science fiction, science fiction is so fascinating because it allows us to advance new ideas from a perspective of reality. Whereas fantasy allows us to advance new ideas from a perspective of unreality. Now, that's a very loose definition, and we could discuss that back and forth. That's not the discussion I want to bring up. But the point is, a lot of people have the same general ideas that they want to posit when it comes to science fiction. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Again, I like this episode. But you do see a lot of science fiction, especially when it comes to television, occasionally going around and doing a typical science fiction episode. It's also the same reason that you see a lot of drama television shows like Friends or whatever, or God, I don't even know the names of any others, who tend to have typical drama style episodes. You could see the pattern because every now and again you don't have a lot of creative ideas and you want to just go back to the well, or because it's the kind of idea that you want to express within this particular genre. It's the kind of thing that fits within it. In this case, this kind of supernatural souls, undead, dead kind of a thing has actually been posited quite a bit in science fiction. I bring all that up because it's interesting to me that this is the value of presentation. And Lord knows, for all of its many strengths, Babylon 5 usually fails at presentation, as Season 1 kind of showed us, and as some of Season 5 shows us as well. And there are other episodes as well. But here we see a typical science fiction idea done in an unusual style, in the sense that, if you look at this on paper, just rewind time for a moment. You've never seen this episode. You're a big fan of Babylon 5, and you find out there's a new episode coming out about a bunch of dead people suddenly showing up on the station and talking to the characters. What's your gut reaction? If you don't quite understand the parallel, how many of you were really upset when they mentioned that there were going to be aliens in Indiana Jones 4? Because that's the same gut reaction of, huh? But if they'd done it right, that could have worked in Indy. Whether they did or not is another topic, but I think they did it right here. I am surprised, really, by how well they did it. But, all of that segue aside, let's get back to the main point here. Jakar is the one part of this episode I don't like, and I can't believe I'm saying that I don't like Jakar in a Babylon 5 episode. But he shows up and he's like, you don't understand, you can't do this. Never explains himself. never enunciates why, just shows up and rants, like this was season 1 or 2, and none of his character development happened, and basically just to create fake drama and tension, like this is some big horrific event. And they even cheat with the music in some of the earlier acts, excuse me, in Act 1, where it's like deep, dramatic, oh my god, doom music, to make the audience think that something's bad's going to happen, and then, of course, nothing bad happens. Everything's fine. In fact, what the closest thing to a crisis in this episode is figuring out how to communicate with the rest of Bab 5, which they solve basically in time to say, yeah, everything's cool. Like, they didn't even need to do that. It was just, checking in. We're cool. You're cool? We're cool. Cool. Don't have the sunglasses yet. I swear they're on their way. I think they're actually supposed to be here today, which sucks, but whatever. Next point. Let's talk about each of the people who's visited. First, let's start with Londo. Now, Londo's is probably the most obvious. Every single one of these people has some kind of subconscious mentality or desire or perspective which is presented through and helps develop their character, and in some cases their character arc, through who comes back. In Garibaldi's case, it's Dodger. Now, most of you probably don't even remember Dodger, but Dodger was the Gropos, the grunt, the ground pounder. Oh, God, I don't remember how long ago now. It's been a while. It was season 2 or 3. And she shipped out in order to fight a major battle in which she died. And it was kind of a mess. She's back. Why Dodger? Keep in mind, Garibaldi is basically married, if not actually married. You know what? I don't actually remember if he's legally married or not. But he is emotionally married at this point in time, regardless of the legality of it. He is with Liz. And he's got his whole job as head of security, and she's doing the whole Edgar's situation. And there's, like, he just decides to go off on this fling with Dodger. It seems very dodgy. I'm sorry. That one just occurred to me like 5 seconds ago, and I had to go for it. It does seem rather unusual. But then you think about it. Because, wait, why am I talking about Garibaldi? I was talking about Londo, wasn't I? God, I must be really tired. Did I seriously segue from Londo to Garibaldi? That's okay, we'll keep talking about Garibaldi. Wow, Laura. Garibaldi. Can you see the bags here? Garibaldi. Why do this? Why go with Dodger of all people? Because Garibaldi is a man who is constantly wound up, constantly on edge. This very episode helps emphasize that because he sleeps with a gun under his pillow. Now, for you and me who have seen all that Garibaldi's gone through, we say, well, of course he sleeps with a gun under his pillow. He's gone through hell and back more than once, just on the show. Never mind what he's been through before the show started. So of course he does. And he's the head of security of the Alliance, and he's got the whole thing going on back in Mars, and there's aliens, and there's the Shadow War, and there's just all this amazing galactic-level complexity he's been having to deal with for so long now. And he keeps putting up with it because he's Garibaldi, but well, he doesn't really want to, does he? The interesting thing about Garibaldi is, underneath all of that, he's a very simple person. Or I should say, I'm saying that wrong. He prefers things uncomplicated, to borrow a phrase from Deep Space Nine. He doesn't want to be super mega. He likes things to be nice and straightforward. Boop, boop, done. And that's exactly what Dodger is. She is super uncomplicated. And I don't mean that in any way as an insult. She's here. She likes him. He likes her. Let's have sex. And that's basically it. No deep emotional entanglement. No long-term romantic commitment. No, what are we going to do about Liz? No, what are we going to do about what's going to happen, when we wake up tomorrow? No, how are we going to deal with, the company? No galactic level importance or having to arrange security for some mega meeting. No. I like you. You like me. Snuggle. It's so obvious in hindsight why Garibaldi seeks this, why Garibaldi subconsciously would want something like this, an escape, if you will. Moving on to Londo. I want to give really quick credit to Peter Jurassic, again, for being an amazing actor. The way he reacts to her when she first shows up is perfect. First we see just shock. You. And then that shock is buried in joy. And then that joy gives way to pleading. The like 5 or 6 emotions he goes through and the first few seconds of seeing her are amazing. I know I say this a lot, but watch his face. Rewatch that scene, watch his face, listen to his tone. He gets so much across in just that brief scene. And what does he say? I wrote this down. I killed the man. I killed the man who killed you, but it did not bring you back. That's such an unusual phrase to say, really. And then he talks about how he's going, they make me emperor. They're a great man, but it doesn't mean anything. I love the idea that Londo, for all of his cynicism and all of his bitterness, is just enough of a blind, idealistic romantic. And we've seen this before. To hope against all hope that if by some possible means him killing Mr. Morden would bring her back, either literally or, and I prefer this answer, metaphorically, to bring back, if you will, Londo's heart or Londo's soul. But it didn't. It didn't make it better. Because that's what he's actually saying there. No matter how you interpret the details, what Londo is saying is, I killed the man who killed you. I avenged you, but it didn't make it better. It did lead to a nice scene with Veer, but that's off topic. This is the most obvious one, which is why I was trying to start with Londo. Londo's subconscious desire is simple. He wants to be himself again. See, Londo has been trudging on a funeral march to being emperor. He does not want to be emperor. In fact, he has stated outright as far back as Season 2 that he does not want to be emperor. He has not wanted to be emperor for a long time. It is being forced upon him. He does not want this yoke. He does not want this burden. And he does not think he is up to it. When asked about the Day of the Dead, who does he respond? I think I should see the first emperor. So maybe I can understand back when the Centauri Republic actually meant something. And maybe, maybe I can get some advice or wisdom on how I'm supposed to make this mean anything, because it so clearly doesn't. And what does he get? He gets Adira, the one woman he truly loved. The one woman who truly loved him, at least by all accounts that we saw. And the connection between the two that allowed him to feel like himself, to give him that confidence and that motivation to be a damned good emperor. Not just another man in another shackle. Then we go to Lockley. Now, from an out-of-character perspective, what's going on with Lockley is actually really obvious. She's a new character and we need to get some backstory in. And it is very obvious. I haven't seen anything official confirming this, but it's very obvious based on the presentation that that's exactly what they were going for here. Okay, quick, backstory. Go, backstory. I do find myself wondering if it was originally going to be Ivanova, like with her brother, for example, instead of this. But I digress. Lockley, we find out, came from a really bad situation. And Lockley is an excellent example of something I've talked about many times when it comes to character arcs. I actually discussed this at length during the Skyrim interactive roleplay. The idea is this. You have a character. Something terrible happens to them. How do they react? Now, if you're talking to a new writer, someone who's just getting used to writing, or is just beginning it, usually in like high school or something like that, their reaction is going to be, oh, they're destroyed by the tragedy, and they're either crushed under it, or they become horrific, and they use it as an excuse to do evil things. One of the things I love about writing is that you can actually have it go both ways, and have both ways make equal amounts of sense. You could have some horrific tragedy happen, and then they rise up from it and say, no, I am not going to let this crush me. I'm not going to let this destroy my life. I'm going to do something about it, and I'm going to endure. Or you could have them utterly annihilated by it, buried underneath it, endure waves of depression, or waves of malaise, inability, or lack of motivation. Or you could have it turn them into a psychopath, or have them go legitimately insane, and so forth and so on. Point being, as a writer, one of the things I feel is most important, and I try to talk about extensively when it comes to character arcs, is that when something happens to someone, good or bad, when they've gone through something, the way they come out of that is kind of on you, the writer. All it has to do is make sense for the circumstances and the character. But you can have them go in any number of directions. And we see two of those directions with Lockley and with... I don't actually remember her name. The dead woman. Because the dead woman killed herself. As she learns at the very end, it was actually suicide. No jokes here. Just, that's what happens sometimes. Sometimes people can't take it. And given the description that Lockley gives, it's only like one sentence. But that one sentence has a lot of weight to it. A burnt-out hotel, struggling to survive, scared of being found out, drugged up, no future, dead. Lockley is galvanized by that death, decides to do something about it. And interestingly enough, it helps to explain why she is so regimental, why she is so rigid, why she is so military. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is up to you. But of course she would be after seeing what happened and after where she's come from, right? Because she tried so hard to get away from what she was. Then we have my favorite. The three people I just talked about weren't actually seeking anything out. They just were going to bed. Garibaldi was tired, Lockley was just like, whatever. Just trying to get an evening in. And Londo, of course, was kind of making light of the whole thing while dreading his future ascension to the throne. Lennier came back to experience the Day of the Dead, hoping to encounter the dead. The one person who really wanted something out of this is the one person who got something he really didn't want. I don't think that's directly connected. I think that's just straight-up irony. And, of course, it's kind of relevant because that's kind of what Mr. Morden is in general. Mr. Morden has always been a bit of a monkey's paw with regards to a writing trope. So, Lennier encounters Mr. Morden. Weird haircut. It always weirds me out. I keep fixating on his hair every time I see him in this episode. Now, you might think, why the hell would Lennier see Mr. Morden? Yeah, I mean, it's not like Lennier hasn't been a frontrunner or a primary agent for some other incredibly powerful individual with lots of political clout and has been a bit of a yes man and doesn't really get a lot of the front time. And you could actually see the parallels between them. It's stretched a bit, I'll admit, but Lennier to Delenn and the Rangers as a whole, and Morden to the Shadows is not as far off as you'd think. Especially since Morden to the Shadows has a lot of uncomfortable parallels to Lennier and the Rangers. In both cases, they were given a choice, and they decided to serve, but it's not really what you'd call a willing servitude. It's more of a, in Lennier's case, I will accept this for all the wrong reasons, and in Morden's case, it was, I will accept this or else I will die, or worse. So, next interesting point, though, about that one. Morden flat out starts saying things. I'm not going to list all of them here. You can rewatch the episode if you want them. And I thought about bringing down a spoilers block to properly discuss these and their effects on the rest of the show. But all I'm going to say is that this is another reason why I say that there's no real denying that these people are actually here and they're actually dead. It was funny to watch, though. But what I find most... Ow! Sorry, that was my back. What I find most interesting about this... Londo needed someone to remind him of who he was, so he can step up to be the man he needed to be. Garibaldi had a desire for the uncomplication. Lockley had to see what she could have become if she hadn't taken the path she had. That's the unconscious desire there. And, of course, the closure on what finally happened with her friend. Lennier follows the pattern of the others, even though he sought this out, because what Lennier was actually seeking was the truth of the matter. Lennier hides behind hides from that truth, hides behind the mask throughout the entirety of his encounter with Mr. Morden, refuses to face it for and on. But you can see in his presentation, you can see in his face, this is the truth. He is just refusing to accept it. No, I will not do this. And yet everything he says sounds like rote, doesn't it? Rather than actual belief. I can no more betray the Anlashak than my fingers could betray my hand. I'm not even going to mention the many ways in which that analogy is ironic, since it's actually quite possible for the fingers to betray the hand, if you think about it. I find it fascinating, the idea that Lennier, in some manner, wants this, wants to just embrace how he really feels and how he really is and just say, screw it. Probably my favorite part of the encounter between Lennier and Morden is when Morden says, she doesn't love you, and she never will. And Lennier says, I know. And Morden says, no, you don't. That foolish, desperate, greedy, selfish, vicious, envious jealousy that Lennier so obviously has and has been growing over several episodes now, that's an ugly thing. And it's no wonder he doesn't want to face it. Having to face that kind of a truth about yourself, I don't think anybody would want to face that. Final thoughts. Right at the end of the episode, there's a scene that I've heard debated before. Not that often, admittedly. This is going to sound like aping, unfortunately, because Sci-Fi Debris actually already covered this, like, I don't even know how long ago. He got to this episode before I did, basically. But there's a scene where Teller, the shorter one, brings Sheridan over and says, because it tells me to. And as they reveal that fact, the music gets all dark and ominous again. What does that mean? Well, most of the obvious options are pretty obvious. You know, the idea that he's speaking of his heart, that his heart tells him to do this. The idea that, you know, it's just another joke. You know, it's just trying to keep the mystery, the mystique of why Teller doesn't talk. The idea of this trying to be a way... sorry. I'm sorry, I was just remembering a Penn and Teller skit that was actually quite funny. Forgive me. The idea of having that whole mystery thing again, you know, Neil Gaiman's overall style. And if I'm being honest, that is probably the most likely thing. The fact that he's just trying to have something that's the truth, but you don't know why or how. So, mystery. But I have always liked the idea that he has a keeper. Earlier in the episode, Penn and Teller, I'm sorry, Bravo and Zudi, or I think, God, I don't even remember their character names. Penn and Teller both comment on how they want to get into politics. And the way they discuss it is actually immensely cynical if you think about it, although has been true in real life history. And I want to talk about this discussion, this topic, just for a moment, if you'll forgive me. If I were to get up and talk about some big, you know, social issue or cultural problem or economic crisis, no one's going to listen to me. I'm some dude on the internet. Doesn't matter what I say. Doesn't matter how I present it. We as a people have always built into us a bias considering the source. I've actually talked about this concept before. If a politician whose job it is to talk about those kind of topics gets up and says the exact same message, you will receive it differently. If I was if I was the president of the United States right now and got on, you know, on the internet, because I would actually use the internet because I'm not an idiot, and, you know, television, and gave an announcement and said the exact same speech in an alternate dimension, I guarantee you people would listen to that because I was a politician, not some guy on the internet. Now, there are obvious reasons why we have that bias in place, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. I just advocate we should probably listen to the message, not just the messenger. But moving on. The relevance here is that a comedian who starts talking about real-life issues and real problems and real consequences and tries to do something to change the world around them isn't going to generate a lot of noise. Ironically, a comedian, with especially very popular comedians like these two, have a lot of capacity for signal boosting, but that's it. All they can really do is boost another person's signal. Anything they say outright is either going to be taken as a joke or, well, not very seriously. And, of course, the other comment that's being said, you get a politician up there. He actually flat out says the real problem is the Senate. I agree, by the way. I've talked at length of my opinions of President Clark himself, but I always keep emphasizing the Clark administration. One thing I don't talk about as often is the Senate in particular, because it is my opinion that the Senate is at least the vast majority of the problem of the Clark administration before, during, and after. That the Senate is a mess for the Earth Alliance, and that's a problem. And he talks about, the garbage that dribbles from their mouth from the senators. And everyone listens to that because they're senators. It's an interesting thing to think about. And it's relevant. Because wouldn't it be interesting if the Drach had approached or the Shadows for that matter, had approached Penn and Teller's characters and looked at their immense, amazing popularity and said, these people are going to be able to interact with people. And these people are going to be able to get keepers onto people. And the very next thing we see in this episode, by the way, or excuse me, I should say previous thing, right before Teller tells him that, is he's talking with Londa Malari. And we know what happened to the previous emperor. Now, it's possible I'm taking this too literally, that this is not a literal Penn and Teller's character had a keeper and that was helping to spread things subterfugely, although that is what I personally do think in my headcanon. But this could also be a metaphoric situation. The idea that this is foreshadowing in an indirect manner for what will eventually happen with regards to the Centauri Republic, which I will not discuss in detail here because spoilers. I would love, as ever, to hear your guys' thoughts, but for now, I'm going to chop this off and get a heating pad on my back. I'll see you around, guys.